In spiccato, the bow bounces off of the string. Now, the first thing you have to remember is that the bow bounces on its own. If you do nothing, the bow will bounce. So the bounce is not something which you actively do, because the bow bounces on its own. In fact, it's rather difficult to stop it from bouncing, which you might remember from your beginning lessons, that to stop it from bouncing, you actually have to do quite a lot. If you do nothing, the bow will bounce. That's very important to remember, because this fact makes spiccato a semi-passive bowing. We are working with the energy of the bow more than with the bow itself. Now, to start off, if you've never done it before, it's a good idea to start with something you can already do. In the first variation, we talked about the finger action of the right hand at the frog with bow changes on the string. Now, the first step towards spiccato is to do the same thing, but do the bow changes off of the string, which means you start above the string, you let the bow land on the string, and you let it leave again. Up bow, the same thing. You start above the string, you let it land on the string, and you lift it again. The finger action is exactly the same. You're just not doing the bow changes on the string. So practice that at about this speed to get used to the bow leaving the string. You're still directing it completely. This has nothing to do with the passive bowing, but the bow is already landing on the string and leaving it again. Now you can move away from the frog slightly and pick up the speed a little bit, and you will notice already that you will need a lot less finger action. You're still doing the finger action, but it's just less, and you're letting the bow do a little bit of the work. So you can still see the finger action, you're still doing it, but you're letting the bow take over a little bit of the work. Now, if you move further away from the frog and pick up the speed even more, you will notice that the bow is starting to do most of the work and you're just reacting with the finger action. It becomes less visible because it's much smaller. You can't see the finger action so well anymore because it's no longer such a large movement, and you're letting the bow bounce and you're just directing down bow, up bow. So remember, if you let the bow drop on the string, it comes up on its own. It's like a ball. So that's nothing you have to do. You just direct that it goes down bow, up bow. And that you do with this finger action, reacting to what the bow is doing. Now, the faster you get, the more you move away from the frog and the less high you bounce, and the more passive this bowing becomes. So if you get even faster, the finger action is hardly visible, it's completely passive, it's just reacting to what the bow is doing and you're letting the bow do most of the work. Have a bit of patience if you've never done this before, and don't move on to the next step before you feel really comfortable with the step that you're working on, because it takes a bit of time to get used to letting the bow take over some of the work. You might feel like you're not very well in control of it, or that you even might be feeling that you might drop the bow. Those are good signs, because that means that you are getting into a passive movement, but it takes getting used to. Another thing to remember is the elbow position. If you're having troubles, check out if your elbow position can be improved. If it's too high, you're not flexible enough to react, and if it's too low, in a way you're also not flexible enough to react. You need to find a comfortable position somewhere in the middle, and that's different for everybody because everybody has different length of arms. So check out that you find a comfortable position for your elbow. Another thing to remember for bouncing bowings is that the violin strings decline towards the scroll. So you're working against gravity if your scroll is too low, which is particularly noticeable in bouncing bowings. So if your scroll is too low, your bow is going to not only want to bounce back up again, it is going to want to bounce towards the fingerboard, and you have to work against that. In fact, one of the biggest problems with sound in spiccato is actually due to that, and you can solve a lot of sound problems by lifting up your scroll, because if your string is more or less parallel to the ground, then your bow can balance on it much better and you don't have to work against gravity the whole time. So that's another good thing to bear in mind. I find it very helpful to practice this variation in various speeds, starting with a very slow speed and very actively directing the bow at the frog. Gives you a lot of control over the sound down here. And then picking up the speed slightly and letting the bow take over more of the work. So like this. I'm still fairly actively directing the bow, but not as actively as down here. And then with a higher speed, I'm going more into the semi-passive bowing and less active directing. And I actually practice it above the speed that I want to do it because I find that helpful for the development of spiccato. So that I found very helpful. Another thing in this variation is that the figures alternately start with down bow and with up bow. And the goal is to get that to sound as identical as possible. That is always difficult because down bow and up bow are not identical, and getting them to sound identical is pretty difficult. So one way of doing it is, for instance, to practice all the figures starting with an up bow. I did that for quite a long time because starting spiccato on an up bow is not as common as starting it on a down bow. So to get as familiar with it as starting with a down bow, I spent quite a bit of time only practicing all the figures starting with an up bow, like this. I did that until I felt completely familiar with starting these figures with an up bow. Now, to get it to sound identical, what you do is you take one figure and practice it alternately starting with down bow and with up bow until you cannot hear a difference anymore. So like this. Each figure. Until you cannot hear a difference anymore, because that's kind of the goal in this variation. You can't hear the difference between the figures which start on a down bow and on an up bow. Now in Sevcic's 40 variations, there are many variations covering all sorts of aspects of spiccato. So as we work our way through the book, we will be going into spiccato in great detail. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments, because it's really difficult to condense everything there is to know about spiccato into one video, which I try to make as short as possible. So chances are I've left something out. So please let me know. Thanks and happy practicing.